10 verses 1 to 15. Again, that's Romans chapter 10 verses 1 to 15. It can be found on page 802 of the Church Bible. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness that comes from God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Moses describes in this way the righteousness that is by the law. The man who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. As the scripture says, anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jews and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And now I invite Felix to introduce today's speaker.
Hello again, everyone. As many of you guys know, that November is Mission Month. And throughout the month of November, we are actually going to invite different speakers from different missions organizations to come and speak to us. But to start us off today, we actually have Sam from Jews for Jesus to come up to share with him his mission and his organization and how we can support him through prayers and or maybe financially things that we can do for his organization. So without further ado, Sam.
Thank you very much, Felix, and thank you, Pastor Aaron, for inviting me. Thank you to you all. I've actually been here before, December of 2014. I was with you, and I'm very excited to be back to share about the work that God is doing among the Jewish people, and it's an honor to be with you at Boone Church during your Missions Month. I love it when churches do Missions Month. That's a very good thing, and it's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to kick off Missions Month. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about me and about Jews for Jesus. I grew up in a believing Jewish home, a Christian Jewish home. Sometimes we use the term Messianic Jew. And so I grew up that way and learned all about how Jesus is the fulfillment of everything our people hoped for. And so when we celebrated Hanukkah or Passover, we learned how they pointed to Jesus. They weren't just these holidays that were a cultural thing. They were something that God gave us in order to point us to our Messiah. But as I grew up, I learned that most of my people don't know the Messiah that I grew up hearing about. In fact, my entire extended Jewish family are not believers in Jesus. They are very typical of the American Jewish community, which is very pluralistic, which is very secular in a lot of ways, with varying degrees of religiosity. So I have Orthodox Jewish relatives, and I have completely secular intermarried Jewish relatives, and everything in between. And so I grew up in sort of proximity to the Jewish community and learned that even though the Jewish people are not only God's people, but they're people that study the Bible and who believe in God, nonetheless, they're far from Jesus. And so that's a burden that I carried and eventually led me to being called to serve as a Jewish missionary, which is something I told God I would never do. I would never be a missionary to Jewish people. And then after I started realizing I might be a missionary to Jewish people. I said I'd never be a missionary with Jews for Jesus, and so here I am. So, my kind of insight into missions for you is this, is that missions really is that God is at work all around us. He's drawing people who don't know Him to Himself. He's working in people's hearts in ways that you could never imagine. And missions is when we go and join Him and be part of what He's doing in the world. And when you do that, He's going to take you sometimes, and I think more often than not, He's going to take you in directions that you wouldn't expect, usually in directions you might not want for yourself. But it's the surrender and embrace of the calling that Jesus gives us. And as we follow Him, it's always better than anything we could have dreamt or come up with on our own, but it's difficult sometimes. It's not what you necessarily want for your life, but it's what God knows is best for you to be doing. Because He doesn't need us to accomplish His mission. He could do it completely by Himself, but He's chosen to call us and to send us. And so I'm happy to pass on this call that God gave me, that God is not just calling you to believe in missions and to think that it's important, but to become active, whether that's through prayer, which is extremely important. That's not just sort of the entry-level position. Prayer is the main engine of missions. Whether it's through prayer, whether it's through giving, which can or could not include financial, there's many ways to give, or whether it means your actual participation in missions, which everyone is called to some degree. Even if that's very small, what that means is that's a small thing that God's doing, and so that's a very big thing. And so if God's calling you this month in any way, I encourage you to respond to it, even if it's scary. And so Jews for Jesus exists because of this, because so many Jewish people don't believe, and as Jewish people who've come to believe in Jesus, we were called to bring the good news of Jesus to our people who don't know Jesus, and not only don't know Jesus, but resist the good news of Jesus. Sometimes I'll be on the street or talking to a person about the gospel, and they'll say to me, "Why don't you just leave us alone? Haven't we Jews had enough of this? We keep, we've made our decision. We want to live our lives. And why can't you just leave us alone?" And to be honest with you, as a Jewish person, I have a lot of sympathy for that. I don't like bothering people. I don't like messing with people's sense of order and the way that they live their lives. But I understand that God loves the Jewish people, and God sent Jesus to the Jewish people, and then to the Gentiles. And I don't have the right to withhold Jesus from my people, even if it makes them happier now. First of all, they need Jesus in order to know their God. Second of all, God deserves the glory for sending the Messiah. And so my being here this morning, I'm excited to extend an invitation to you to join me in this calling, this ministry to the Jewish people. And you guys are in a unique proximity to the Jewish people. First of all, you're in Metro New York City, which is the largest concentration of Jewish people outside of the land of Israel. So there's more Jewish people here in New York than anywhere else in the United States. Anywhere else in the world outside of Israel. There's more Jewish people living in New York City than there are in Jerusalem. Okay? Often Jewish people who live out here, they'll refer to Brooklyn as the real Holy Land. So you guys are actually on the front lines of the Jewish mission field. And by the way, there's a lot of Jewish people in Queens. Does anybody here go to Queens College? Anybody here? Okay. Queens College is one of the highest percentages of Jewish people of the colleges in the United States. All right, so you guys are, whether you realize it or not, you are on one of the front lines of the Jewish mission field. In fact, Queens is probably one of the most underserved areas in Jewish missions. There are Jewish missionaries who live in Queens, but most of us are either in Manhattan, New Jersey, or in Brooklyn. And Queens has many Jewish people who need to hear the gospel. And so what I want to share about this morning is about the ministry of the Apostle Paul and his heart for the Jewish people. And we're going to talk about three things: the motivation for Jewish evangelization, the need for Jewish evangelism, and finally, the method. And after we talk about that, I want to talk about how you can join the mission to the Jewish people, and specifically how you can support Jews for Jesus as well. You might have a card with you that was passed out in your bulletins that, if you look at it, I didn't bring an example up, which is too bad, but it's got a picture of my wife and I. That's my wife, Rebecca, and you can go ahead and tear, oh look, it looks like this. Go ahead and tear that. This is for you to keep, this is like a prayer reminder. You can keep this in your Bibles or stick it on your fridge or on your wall or something. Not just to pray for us, although I'd appreciate that prayer, but to remember to pray for the Jewish people. Maybe you have a friend, someone Jewish that you know, that you can pray for them by name. The other part is a section that you can fill out. And if you want to hear more about Jews for Jesus, you can go ahead and fill that out. If you want our newsletter, you can give us your address. If you don't want your newsletter, you can give us your email. If you want both, you can give us both. But this will just be a way for me to get in touch with you, to know, for me to know, and for our organization to know that this is something that you want to learn more about. And so as I'm speaking, feel free to fill this out. And on your way out, just drop it on that table on the way out, or give it to me, or you can even give it to Pastor Aaron or someone who you know will get it back to me. But this would be a good starting place to learn, okay, so what do I do next? How do I share the gospel with Jewish people? What can I do? So keep that in mind as I speak. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But we looked at the book of Romans, which was written by Paul, who, if you know the story of Paul, Paul was not always a strong believer in Jesus, was he? In fact, he began his kind of career in the New Testament not as an apostle, but as a persecutor of the church, right? And he was a persecutor because the Apostle Paul, or as he would have probably been known then as Rabbi Saul, he was a Jewish leader. He was a student of the rabbis, some of the greatest rabbis who are still revered by the Jewish people today. And if you know anything about Jewish culture, we are a studying culture. Our scholars are held in the highest regard. And Paul was a scholar. And he studied with the greatest scholars. And he understood that this new movement it was still at this time all Jewish, people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, was a direct threat to the centralized power, religious authorities in Jerusalem. And so he opposed the gospel of Jesus, but upon encountering Jesus for himself, made a complete reversal, turned his life around, not because he changed himself, but because God changed his heart. And so Paul was always a passionate, zealous Jewish person who very much cared about honoring God. But when he encountered Jesus, he realized that the things he believed about God were completely wrong. But in a sense, his passion didn't change. It was just redirected now towards God's mission. And God called him not to be a missionary to his own people, the Jewish people, but to be a missionary to the nations. But he never lost his heart to the Jewish people. And if we look at what he writes, we see that. He says in this chapter, verses 1 through 4, Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they might be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So here we see Paul's motivation. His heart's desire and prayer to God is that the Israelites, his people, the Jewish people, might be saved. He knows from experience what it's like to be a Jewish person who doesn't have Jesus in their lives. And in chapter 9, verse 3, he explains even clearer. He says that I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. This was something that deeply troubled Paul, that his people did not know their Messiah. And it caused him anguish. And it wasn't just because he's a Jewish person. It's because the more he came to know Jesus and the more he came to know God, the more he understood God's broken heart with the fact that the children of Israel did not know him. In fact, if you read the prophets, especially Jeremiah or Isaiah, you see God's heart for the Jewish people who continuously rejected his messengers, who continually went their own way when God called them back. God said things like, I have loved you with an everlasting love, and yet the Jewish people never returned to God. And so Paul is becoming more like God, and that his heart is getting more and more broken for his Jewish people. Which is such an important thing, that it starts with love, that it starts with a care and compassion for people that do not know Jesus. Because let me tell you, it's very easy for us when we are sharing the gospel with people and they're rejecting us, it's very easy for our hearts to get hardened towards them. And for us to start taking a superior attitude even. To say, well, I know the truth and you believe in lies. I do what is right, you do what is wrong. It's very easy. In fact, Christians are often guilty of this, that we look at unbelievers almost with a disgust sometimes. We just can't understand why they don't believe what we believe, why they don't know what we know. But Paul didn't approach his people that way, which is incredibly impressive to me because they did not treat him very well. The Jewish people arrested him, beat him, they insulted him, they persecuted him, and he didn't grow bitter. But his love for them grew more and more as he understood more and more what God's heart for the Jewish people was. And that was Paul's motivation. Love for his people based on the love that God had for the Jewish people and has for the Jewish people. And Paul's not only motivated for compassion for these people that don't know Jesus, he was motivated by the idea that Jesus really is the Messiah, that he really is the one that God sent. And so he wanted the truth to be known. God deserved glory for what he had done. And when people don't submit their lives to God, it's a denial of what God has done. It's a denial of God's glory. And Paul loved God, and Paul loved the Jewish people, and so he wanted to see Jewish people reconciled to God through Jesus. And so the foundation for all of our ministry, whether it's ministry to Jewish people or ministry to another group of people, has to be love. And we're going to be tempted to make it something else. We're going to be tempted to make it about maybe power. The ability to influence people is a temptation for us. That we want to make the world more like we want it to be, a world better for us. And so sometimes we can use ministry to exert power over people. There's many temptations to have motivations for missions that are different than love. Love for God or love for people. But missions must begin with love. And the way to stoke that love in our hearts is to know God more, to see God's love. And that's in the Bible. God's love, not just for the Jewish people, but for all people, is so clear as we read the Bible, as we see that this is a God who wants to redeem, who wants to save, who wants to bring people near to Him. And so as we get to know God more and as we love Him more, we will learn to love people more. And we'll be equipped then with the right motivation for mission. And so if you're wondering, how can I learn to love the Jewish people? I would say that if you just do two things, you'll discover it. If you read the Bible and see, look, these are these Jewish people in the Old and New Testament. Jesus Himself is Jewish. This is the story of what God did to save this people. And then secondly, as you meet real, live, breathing Jewish people, and you see them as they really are, then you'll see that these are people that God loves. Now the next thing we come to is now then the need. And this is very important, I think, because I think that I meet Christians all the time, and there's sort of an assumption that the Jewish people, there's one of two things that I've kind of found. Jewish people are either like these holy saints who are just incredibly spiritual, and God is on their side, God is with them, and man, wouldn't it be great if we were more like them? Wouldn't it be great if we were more Jewish? That we sort of look at Jewish people as if they're these superhuman beings, or we say, oh, there's no difference, they're just like everybody else. I've kind of encountered both. People love to quote the Galatians, there's no Jew, there's no Greek. We're all one. And so Jewish people, you can just treat them like everybody else. Very quickly with the everybody else, no one's just like everybody else. Everyone's unique. Everyone has their own story. Everyone comes from a certain background. If we treat everybody like they're just everybody else, then we never say anything. You have to treat everybody as individuals or as part of communities that are distinct. So that's all I'll say about that. The second thing, though, is more, I think, kind of prevalent sometimes, and I think a bigger hindrance to missions in many ways to the Jewish people. When Christians oftentimes look at Jewish people and say, wow, they're a very holy people, and then combine that with guilt over the past. Things like the Holocaust or Christian persecution of Jewish people, there's a temptation to say, well, maybe Jewish people really don't need Jesus because they already have God. They already have 3/4 of the Bible. They're already praying all the time. They're already this like holy, amazing people. Maybe they don't really need Jesus. Maybe they believe in Jesus without realizing they believe in Jesus. There's all kinds of weird stuff like that. It comes from, I think, basically a good place. That you don't want to hurt people who don't need to be hurt. The problem, though, is that the Bible makes it very clear that Jewish people do need Jesus. Because Jewish people aren't this separate kind of holy class all to ourselves. I know from going to Passover Seders and from interacting with my family and interacting with Jewish people I've known my whole life, we are very human. There's a saying that I really like, Jewish people are just like everyone else, only more so. I think that's really helpful to me. We're not these sort of special people who need our own special class. We are real people, and we are just like you. We sin. We do things that are wrong. We live lives where we don't think about God. Most Jewish people don't think about God much at all, to be honest. My family, they go to synagogue. They don't think about God, basically at all. My grandma thinks about God a little bit, but if you talk to her, she has no idea who He is. Even I've talked to religious Jewish people who have beards, their head coverings, and they'll tell me, I don't believe in God. So we are just like everybody else, which surprises people. And that's why Paul makes very clear that we need the gospel. He says something interesting. He says, look, I can testify that they are zealous for God in verse 2, but that zeal is not based on knowledge. When we look at especially religious Jewish people, which are the most visible part of our community, it's a very small part of our community. You'd be surprised how few they are in relation to the whole. But we look at their lives, and from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, every thought is about spirituality, prayer, and God. Every ritual, everything they do is bathed in Judaism. And we can look at that and say, wow, what zeal. I wish I lived like that. I wish I had that discipline. I wish I had that prayer life. Paul says, you know what? Yes, that's true. Those Jewish people you see who pray 3 times a day, who do every commandment they can, who try to live righteous, moral lives, they have a zeal for God. But it's not according to knowledge. Just because we have passion doesn't mean that that's enough. Good intentions don't get us to God. Especially if that passion is directed toward the wrong ideas. So think about like a football game, for instance. If someone runs 100 yards the wrong direction, they don't get a touchdown because of effort, right? The Jewish people are like that it's all this effort, all this passion, but it's misdirected. The goal is to establish our own righteousness rather than receiving the gift of righteousness that God gave us through the Messiah. And so, no matter how impressed we are by Jewish people's zeal and religion, if they don't know Jesus, who is the whole point of the Torah that God gave Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the prophets, if we don't have Jesus, we don't have God. And the same goes for us in the Christian community, that we're going to meet Christians who are really good Christians, who go to church every Sunday, who don't swear, who give, but who aren't really surrendering their lives to Jesus so much as they're trying to make sure that they're good with God. They're giving what God's asking. They're doing what they have to do to get into heaven. Maybe that's what we do. To be honest, we all drift into that from time to time. This is a very human thing. It's not a uniquely Jewish thing. It's not a uniquely any religion thing. It's very human for us to say, let me guarantee that I'm accepted by God. But the truth is, as Paul says here, there's no difference, he says in verse 12, between Jew and Gentile. We need the gospel because we're trying to earn our own way to heaven. So we have the motivation, the love for the Jewish people. We have the need that Jewish people, if they don't have Jesus, don't have God. And finally, we have the method, the way that God has appointed for the Jewish people to meet Jesus. Paul asks in verse 14, how then can they, and they means the Jewish people who have rejected Jesus, how can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe on the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. I love this because it's so practical. They have to hear the message of Jesus. They need to hear it. But if they don't hear it, what can they do? There's a question people ask. They say, what about people who've never heard the gospel? And we imagine that villager on a remote island who's never heard the gospel. And we wonder what would happen to them if they died without ever hearing the gospel. But as a Jewish person hearing about that, I could respond by saying, well, I come from a people group that's heard a lot about Jesus. For 2,000 years, there's been people telling us about Jesus. But unfortunately, most of what we heard is very bad. Jesus, until very recently, and for many Jewish people still is, the word Jesus is basically a curse for Jewish people. It's a name that strikes fear in the hearts of Jewish people, anxiety, because for thousands of years, Christians have been bad representatives to Jewish people. Not all Christians. There have been some Christians who've been amazing witnesses to the Jewish people, who've really impressed Jewish people with their love for God and have won the hearts of many Jewish people to faith. But overall, if you talk to just the average Jewish person about their impression about Christianity and the Jewish people, they'd say, oh, it's not been pretty. It's been really bad. Even Martin Luther, our hero of the faith, who is a personal hero of mine because of many of the great things he did to recover the gospel and to present us with the gospel. He said terrible things about the Jewish people, and he encouraged people to burn down their synagogues and to beat them up and to throw them in jail and to take away their holy books. And so Jewish people have heard about Jesus, but it's not the Jesus that we know. And so we can talk all day about what it is that God will do with those who either haven't heard or who've heard bad reports about Jesus. But ultimately, the answer that Paul gives and the answer that God gives is we need to go. We need to be the ones to share the true good news with Jewish people, which really is good news to the Jewish people. It might feel like bad news to them. It might sound like bad news to them. But it's good news because it's an opportunity for them to hear the truth about God's love for them, that God sent their Redeemer that they pray for every day, and that through Jesus, they could have a relationship with God. And this afternoon, I'd like to tell you that you can be part of that story, whether that means praying for Jewish people, whether that means giving to Jewish ministries, whether that means saying to your Jewish friend, I believe that Jesus is your Messiah. That you can be a very small piece about what God is doing to bring people to the Messiah of Israel. And so that's what Jews for Jesus does. We just completed a outreach last fall where we spoke with hundreds of Jewish people about the gospel, and we're following up with some of them. I meet with Jewish people and get to do Bible studies with them, but we can't do it alone. There's too many Jewish people. We're too small a group, and really it's all of our responsibilities together as the church to go and to be God's representatives. And so I just want to close with a few very simple ways that I think that you can join with us and with many other Jewish ministries in the mission to bring the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, to the Jewish people. The first is through your prayers. And I mentioned this is the engine for missions, and I really do believe that. And I would encourage you to... Who here knows a Jewish person who doesn't know Jesus? Raise your hand if you know someone. Okay. If you do, if you're one of those people who raises your hand, pray for that person. Pray that God would reveal His love for them and that they would have an opportunity to come to faith in Jesus. And you might not even get a chance to share the gospel with them. But that prayer really is part of what God's doing. And even praying for people, that often that we wonder, how can I share the gospel with this person? If we start praying for that person, it's shocking what God will do to put you in the right position to share the gospel at the right place at the right time. So pray. Pray for the Jewish people you know. Pray for our ministry. Pray for Jews for Jesus work around the world. The other way that you can join us is by building friendships with Jewish people. Just not as a missions project, but as a real, just I want to be your friend. I want to get to know you. And as you get to know your friend and they get to know you, they're naturally going to hear about Jesus. So you don't have to rehearse a speech or give them all these arguments or these verses or these prophecies. Just get to know people. Get to know Jewish people. They are around. And it's a very easy way for them to get introduced to Jesus. Finally, I want to encourage you to share your own story with Jewish people about how God has changed you. Get to know your story. Your story is a powerful witness to people that your lives have been changed by Jesus, and their life can be changed too. You don't have to be a Bible scholar to share the good news with people. And especially with Jewish people, we say, oh, they know the Old Testament by heart, don't they? Listen, let me tell you, you probably know the Bible better, even the Old Testament, better than 99% of Jewish people, even Orthodox Jewish people. But share your testimony. Share the story of God changing your life. And so I just want to wrap up by saying it's been an honor to be with you. And I'd love to stay after and talk with you. So please don't just, if you have a question, come and talk to me. If you know, or even like if you have to run, write me an email. Drop off those cards by the table out back there on the way out. I also will be there. There's some books and some tracts that I can give you. There's some that are for sale. Some of them are free. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have there. But thank you once again for inviting me to share about what God is doing among the Jewish people. Thank you so much.